Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Christian Educational Ministries Weekend Bible Study. Last week, we began this new study on the book of Esther, and we'll continue this week with a little more background information. Now, where were we? Okay, so far my main goal has been to establish the timeline or the approximate dates of these three Second Temple era books, the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and now Esther. Many commentaries refer to them as post-exilic books. We ended up last week just beginning to get into Ezra's genealogy. All right, but what's so important about Ezra's genealogy, and what does it have to do with Esther? Well, we need to see Ezra's genealogy because his genealogy is essential to establish who his father was and when and where his father lived and died. And why is that important? So we can know when Ezra was born, or at least have a good idea of when he was born. So here's a synopsis of Ezra's history that'll help us estimate his age. Ezra's father, Seraiah, was the chief priest in Jerusalem, and he was killed by Nebuchadnezzar in the same year Jerusalem was ransacked and destroyed in 586 B.C. And the account of that is in 2 Kings 25, verses 18 to 21. That was the year of the third and final captivity of Jerusalem. Now, remember, there were three different invasions of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar over a period of 18 or 19 years. Daniel and his three friends, and many others, were taken captive in the first Babylonian invasion, and that was in 604 BC. But Ezra's father, Seraiah, the chief priest, was murdered in 586, and like I said, that was the final invasion and captivity of Jerusalem. Now, we don't know how old Ezra was when his father was killed in 586 BC, but he must have been pretty young, maybe even an infant. Well, let's say Ezra was born in 587 BC, and that would be the year before his father was killed, and that would have made him 51 years old in 536 BC. 536 BC, that was the year of Cyrus's decree to rebuild the temple. And when the temple was completed in 515 BC, he would have been about 73 years old. And that was the 6th year of the reign of Darius, according to Ezra 6:15. Ezra arrived in Jerusalem in the 7th year of the king's reign, according to Ezra 7:8. Most commentaries would have us believe Ezra and Nehemiah arrived in Jerusalem decades after the temple had been completed, during the reigns of the Persian kings who came after Darius the Great, such as Artaxerxes Longimanus or Artaxerxes Memnon. But when you do the math, that just doesn't make any sense. Let's play with some numbers just to see what we come up with. And these dates and ages may be off a few years, but here goes. And thanks are in order to William Struess for these scenarios. Let's say the 7th year of Darius was 515 BC. That year, Ezra's minimum age would be 69 years old. And 14 years later, at the dedication of Nehemiah's wall, Ezra would be 83. But what if this is talking about the 7th year of Artaxerxes Longimanus? He was the king who came after Darius. That would be 458 BC, and Ezra's minimum age would be 126 years. And 14 years later, at the dedication of the wall, he would have been 140 years old. Well, let's take it a little further to the next king. What if it was referring to the 7th year of Artaxerxes Memnon? Well, that would be 398 BC, and Ezra's minimum age would be 186. And that would make him 200 years old at the dedication of the wall in the book of Nehemiah. So, you see, it just doesn't make sense when commentaries point to an Artaxerxes other than Darius the Great Artaxerxes, or when they suggest Ezra and Nehemiah came to Jerusalem 3 or 4 decades after the completion of the temple. I hope I haven't completely confused you on these ages and dates, but I think it becomes clear by doing some careful reading of these chapters and by just using plain old common sense. And really, it may be more confusing and implausible to consider the dates of most commentaries. Here's something to think about when you're studying the Bible, or when you're studying or reading anything, really. You can't always trust your sources. Whatever or whoever your sources may be, they may not be accurate all the time. It's not that there's something nefarious going on necessarily. It's just that, well, no one's perfect and everyone makes mistakes. Some writers and researchers may not have the time or resources to check their sources, which may not be accurate. And so inaccuracies or untruths can continue to be perpetuated. And sometimes the so-called smart guys don't get it. Sometimes they might go along to get along rather than disagree with their peers and risk looking foolish. And sometimes they just might lack wisdom and basic common sense. And then other times, because people may reject God, they adopt all manner of inexplicable ideas. Like Paul wrote in Romans 1:22, where it says, although they claimed to be wise, they became fools. Now, don't get me started with the fake news phenomenon. That's a whole different problem. We've basically come to the point where we have to question virtually everything we hear, read, or even see. And it boils down to this. We all need to be praying daily for wisdom and discernment. We need guidance from the Holy Spirit and help from God in everything we do, really. And here's the thing. There has always been deceit in this world. All we have to do is go back to the Garden of Eden to see how the father of lies got all this dishonesty and deception started from the very beginning. It just seems like in the last few years, the deceit, the lies, the corruption and lawlessness has been ramping up at breakneck speeds like never before. So with that in mind, we have every reason in the world to draw closer to God and ask for His help and direction in every aspect of our life. Okay, that may have been a little bit of a digression, but let's get back to Esther. So there's a lot more to learn about the life and times of Queen Esther, but why don't we just begin reading through the book and we'll learn more as we go. It's always good to follow along in your own Bible and maybe have a notebook in case you want to jot down some notes. I'll be using the New International Version because it's easy to read and understand, but I may refer to other translations from time to time if need be. So let's begin. The Book of Esther, chapter 1, verse 1. Verse 1 says, "This is what happened during the time of Xerxes, the Xerxes who ruled over 127 provinces stretching from India to Cush." And this would be Xerxes, the great Darius, as we've surmised so far in this study. Verse 2. "At that time King Xerxes reigned from his royal throne in the citadel of Susa. And in the 3rd year of his reign he gave a banquet for all of his nobles and officials. The military leaders of Persia and Media, the princes, the nobles of the provinces were all present." Okay, Susa, or Shushan, was the royal city of the Persian kings, but it was never the royal city of the Medes. The empire was at first known as the Medo-Persian Empire when the Medes were dominant, but at this point Persia dominates, and it's known as the Persian Empire. This is the same palace or citadel that Daniel referred to in Daniel 8:2, and it's the same citadel in which Nehemiah worked, serving as the king's cupbearer, and that's mentioned in Nehemiah 1:1. During the 3rd year of his reign, the temple was still under construction, and it would be completed 3 years from that point. Verse 4. For a full 180 days he displayed the vast wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and glory of his majesty. We really can't imagine what this 6-month-long extravaganza must have been like. The world had probably never seen anything like this demonstration of military might. Not sure if they had parades back then, but there were surely massive displays of power with an endless array of state-of-the-art war machines, which must have been demonstrated by tens of thousands of troops for all the dignitaries and invited guests to see. After all, he was showing off his vast power, after all. It must have been something to witness that there were endless feasts and banquets that just lasted for days on end. This was the exhibition of the power and grandeur of the reign of Darius the Great Artaxerxes. And it was arguably the time of Persia's greatest wealth and power. Here's what Daniel said in a prophecy about this time. It's over in Daniel 11, verse 2. And actually, this isn't Daniel speaking. It's the angel who came to him in the previous chapter, Daniel 10. And this happened on the last day of Daniel's 21-day fast, when the angel, probably Gabriel, came to him with this prophecy. But let's just go to Daniel 11 and read it. And let's start in verse 1. Daniel 11:1. And in the 1st year of Darius the Mede, I took my stand to support and protect him. Now remember, this is the angel talking, and he's telling this to Daniel. This Darius the Mede isn't to be confused with Darius Hystaspes, who is the Darius during Esther's time. Darius the Mede was the conquering general who invaded Babylon, and for his victory over Babylon, Cyrus rewarded him with the kingship over Babylon. Okay, now let's go to verse 2, Daniel 11:2. Now then, I will tell you the truth. 3 more kings will arise in Persia, and then a 4th who will be far richer than all the others. When he has gained power by his wealth, he will stir up everyone against the kingdom of Greece. Okay, here are the 3 kings of Persia that I believe this verse is talking about. Cyrus was the first king of Persia, then Cambyses II, then came Bardas, he only ruled for 6 months or so, and then the 4th king would be Darius, the Great Artaxerxes. And he would be far richer than all the others, the angel told Daniel. Now, these 4 kings, they weren't the only Persian kings. There were actually 5 more kings that followed Darius, but they aren't included in this verse, possibly because they weren't involved in the reconstruction of the temple or Nehemiah's wall around Jerusalem. Nor were they directly involved with the Jews as such, so because they weren't an integral part of this Second Temple era, they just weren't mentioned in the Bible. But just for the historical record, here are the names of the 5 Persian kings who followed Darius the Great. There was Xerxes I, and then there was Artabanus, then Artaxerxes Longimanus, after whom came Darius II, and lastly came Artaxerxes Memnon. Now let's read verse 3, and it's still Gabriel talking. Daniel 11:3. Then a mighty king will arise, who will rule with a great power and do as he pleases. Now this verse refers to the rise of Alexander the Great, who conquered the Persian Empire, but that's for another Bible study. Okay, let's move to verse 5 of Esther 1, but first, let's take a short break.
Who is Babylon the Great? Is she a woman or a nation, a people or a religious system? And what is her role at the time of the end? Write or call for a free copy of the program titled Babylon the Great. Write to Born to Win, Post Office Box 560, White House, Texas 75791. Or call toll-free 1-888-BIBLE-44.
All right, we're back. Verse 5, Esther 1:5. When these days were over, the king gave a banquet lasting 7 days in the enclosed garden of the king's palace for all the people from the least to the greatest who were there in the citadel of Susa. This banquet must have been huge. The Albert Barnes commentary says this, quote, "Feasts on this extensive scale were not unusual in the East. Cyrus is said on one occasion to have feasted all of the Persians. That means he gave a feast for all of them. Even ordinarily, the latter Persian monarchs entertained 15,000 persons at their table. That's just amazing. Verse 6. The garden had hangings of white and blue linen, fastened with cords of white linen and purple material to silver rings on marble pillars. There were couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and other costly stones. Porphyry, by the way, was a very hard rock that was mined in Egypt, and it's dark purple with a reddish hue. It sort of looks like the type of marble you'd see on a countertop in a nice kitchen, and if you're curious and you want to see what it looks like, you could just go to Google Images and type in porphyry, and you'll see a bunch of different images come up with different colors of porphyry. Verse 7, wine was served in goblets of gold, each one different from the other, and the royal wine was abundant in keeping with the king's liberality. Verse 8, by the king's command, each guest was allowed to drink with no restrictions, for the king instructed all the wine stewards to serve each man whatever he wished. Now, why do you think we're being told all this? It seems to me that there would have been a lot of other information we'd rather be hearing about, such as what happened to Esther's parents, or how long had she been an orphan? How old was she? Did she and Mordecai come to Shushan from Babylon? Or were their ancestors exiled from Israel's captivity? But no, we're being told about the splendiferous life and times of King Darius. One might expect the author would be describing this excessive 7-day extravaganza as a week full of gluttony and drunken debauchery, brought to you by a depraved party animal of biblical proportions who had a total lack of restraint. But we're not reading anything like that. Rather, we're seeing a demonstration of a benevolent ruler who loves to share the wealth and grandeur of his kingdom with everyone, it appears. And why is that? Well, here's what I think. I think the writer of this book wants us to see how vast and powerful this Persian Empire was, and that this particular king, King Darius, was fabulously wealthy and remarkable in so many ways. And he was truly deserving of his title, the Great Artaxerxes. But in addition to the incredible wealth and power he wielded, look at how generous he was with his guests. All of his guests. And remember, this ostentatious blowout wasn't strictly for the high-ranking officials. It was for everyone, from the least to the greatest, as it states in verse 5. These 3 books of the Second Temple era, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, they all have a common thread, And I think the author of this book wants us to see that this King Darius, the great Artaxerxes, is the same wealthy and powerful and generous king who authorized and financed the reconstruction of the temple after it had been delayed for several years under the reign of Cambyses II. King Darius made sure they had everything that was needed to build and maintain all of the activities of the temple and temple worship. Likewise, it was the same beneficent king who financed Ezra and his massive entourage who ventured to Jerusalem in the second half of the book of Ezra. You can read about all the treasures that the king bestowed on Ezra in Ezra chapter 7. Darius spent a fortune to make sure Ezra and all of the Jews could succeed in their priestly endeavors at the temple. Like I said, he supplied everything they needed, from wine to oil to gold, silver, livestock for sacrifices, and anything else they needed. So too was this king big-hearted with Nehemiah. Not only in financing Nehemiah's trip to Jerusalem, but in giving him the time off away from his duties which were so valuable to the king. Nehemiah was basically given carte blanche by King Darius to do whatever needed to be done, and he was even given a military escort to Jerusalem for his protection. To be sure, King Darius was an impressive individual and king. So let's continue on. The festivities in Shushan are not over by any means. In fact, things are about to get interesting as we observe the goings-on at this regal get-together. Verse 9. Queen Vashti also gave a banquet for the women in the royal palace of King Xerxes. On the seventh day, when King Xerxes was in high spirits from wine, he commanded the 7 eunuchs who served him, Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zether, and Carcass. He commanded them to bring before him Queen Vashti, wearing her royal crown, in order to display her beauty to the people and nobles, for she was lovely to look at. Verse 12. But when the attendants delivered the king's command, Queen Vashti refused to come. Then, as you might well expect, the king became furious and burned with anger. Okay, what do you think is going on here? This is a profound act of disobedience. This could have cost her her life. This is a very big deal. A casual observation of these verses might lead you to believe that Vashti's conduct was out-and-out rebellion to the king and disobedience to her husband. Certainly that's what the king thought. And I've heard people quip that Queen Vashti must have been the first radical feminist, and she should have completely submitted to the king because, well, she was the royal wife after all. But maybe there's a little more to the story. Not that it will matter to the king. Verse 9 says, the queen was also having a banquet for the women of the royal palace, and this was apart from the king's banquet. This was the custom in Persia. Ladies weren't allowed to attend state banquets, but it was perfectly acceptable to have concubines and harlots at the men's banquet. In fact, it was expected. But the wives weren't permitted to be there, and they weren't permitted to be there for the very reason that the concubines and harlots were there. Not only was it a custom to forbid the ladies to attend these functions, but it was the law. John Wesley's commentary states, it was the law of Persia that was to keep men's wives, and especially queens, from the view of other men. End quote. The queen probably also assumed the king was drunk. Remember verse 10? Verse 10 politely states the king was in high spirits after 7 days of drinking. I should think so. Well, could it have been she refused to go because she was maintaining her royal dignity? Here's what John Darby says about Queen Vashti. Quote, "And much should she be commended for it. What woman possessing even a common share of prudence and modesty could consent to expose herself to the view of such a group of drunken bacchanalians? Her courage was equal to her modesty. She would resist the royal mandate rather than violate the rules of chaste decorum." Still quoting, "Her contempt of worldly grandeur, when brought in competition with what every modest woman holds dear and sacred, is worthy of observation. She well knew that this act of disobedience would cost her her crown, if not her life also. But she was regardless of both, as she conceived her virtue and honor were at stake. Her humility was greatly evidenced in this refusal. She was beautiful and might have shown herself to great advantage and have had a fine opportunity of gratifying her vanity, if she had any, but she refused to come." End quote. So that gives us a little different perspective of Queen Vashti's courageous behavior. Still, her regal decency didn't score any points with the king. He was outraged and no doubt humiliated in front of all of his friends and officials, and you got to know this was an immediate game changer. Just moments earlier, the revelry may have reached an apex when the king announced he was going to bring his gorgeous queen in so everyone could see for themselves her dazzling beauty. The crowds, they must have roared with excitement because they'd probably never laid eyes on the queen before. Then came the bad news. She refused to come to the banquet. And in an instant, the raucous festivities stopped, and dread may have set in as something horrific was about to happen. So now what? Verse 13. "Since it was customary for the king to consult experts in the matter of law and justice, he spoke with the wise men who understood the times, and were closest to the king: Karshena, Zethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsena, and Memucan, the 7 nobles of Persia and Media, who had special access to the king and were highest in the kingdom. Well, these were his top advisors, and they were probably his lawyers. And they were all there at the banquet." Verse 15. "According to the law, what must be done to Queen Vashti?" he asked. "She has not obeyed the command of King Xerxes that the eunuchs have taken to her." Then Memucan replied in the presence of the king and the nobles, "Queen Vashti has done wrong, not only against the king, but also against the nobles and the peoples of all the provinces of King Xerxes. For the queen's conduct will become known to all the women, and so they will despise their husbands and say, 'King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she would not come.'" Verse 18. "This very day the Persian and Median women of the nobility who have heard about the queen's conduct will respond to all the king's nobles in the same way. There will be no end to disrespect and discord. Therefore, if it pleases the king, let him issue a royal decree, and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, which cannot be repealed, that Vashti is never again to enter the presence of King Xerxes. Also, let the king give her royal position to someone else who is better than she." And here's what Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown commentary says about this whole ordeal. Quote, "The combined wisdom of all the advisers, it seems, was enlisted to consult with the king what course should be taken after so unprecedented an occurrence as Vashti's disobedience of the royal summons. It is scarcely possible for us to imagine the astonishment produced by such a refusal in a country and a court where the will of the sovereign was absolute. The assembled grandees were petrified with horror at the daring affront. Alarm for the consequences that might ensue to each of them in his own household next seized on their minds, and the sounds of the Bacchanalia revelry were hushed into a deep and anxious consultation what punishment to inflict on the refractory queen. But a purpose was to be served by the flattery of the king and the enslavement of all women. The counselors were too intoxicated or obsequious to oppose the courtly advice of Memucan, which was unanimously resolved, with a wise regard to the public interest of the nation, that the punishment of Vashti could be nothing short of degradation from her royal dignity. The doom was accordingly pronounced and made known in all parts of the empire." End quote. The king's counselors clearly didn't see the situation as Vashti did. Not by a long shot. And given the absolute power of the king, she was really fortunate she didn't get the death penalty. And had this edict not been given, the counselors would foresee their own trouble brewing at home with their own wives. Verse 20. "Then, when the king's edict is proclaimed throughout all his vast realm, all the women will respect their husbands from the least to the greatest." The king and his nobles were pleased with this advice, so the king did as Memucan proposed. He sent dispatches to all parts of the kingdom, to each province in its own script, and to each people in their own language, proclaiming that every man should be ruler over his own household, using his native tongue. Okay, I know the king's edict wouldn't fly here in the 21st century. In this age of feminism, sexual neutralization, transgendering, and pusillanimous men. But this was 2,500 years ago, and it was a male-dominated, male monarchy. But consider the last verse and think about how it might affect our culture and our society in a positive way. Let's read it again. "He sent dispatches to all parts of the kingdom, to each province in its own script, and to each people in their own language, proclaiming that every man should be ruler over his own household, using his native tongue." Think of it. Maybe Chicago wouldn't be a virtual war zone if responsible fathers ruled over their own households. The only problem I see with the king's edict is they didn't have access to the 5th chapter of Ephesians like we do. But if you add to this edict, that is, what we read in Ephesians 5, beginning in verse 22, the edict would be right on. That's your homework for tonight, reading Ephesians 5, verses 22 through 33. And that wraps up chapter 1, and it's a logical stopping point for this week. Next week, we'll get into chapter 2 of the book of Esther. And be sure to spend some time up at the Born to Win website and make it a regular habit to listen to the vast library of Ronald L. Dart's sermons, Bible studies, and radio programs. There's a ton of great material up there, and it's all good. So take a look around and tune in. I hope you're enjoying this Bible study on the book of Esther. Be sure to be back here next week at CEM Weekend Bible Study and tell your friends and family about us. Good night, everyone, and have a very good week.